A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. We will find out tonight one of the most important moments in the long and complex history of the world. With those words, Donald Trump abruptly brought the Christian Easter holiday to an end on Tuesday morning and put the entire world on edge. Even by the standards of the 47th President of the United States, the statement sounded exceptionally sinister. The moment he was referring to was the evening deadline of yet another ultimatum issued to Iran. Some feared a new wave of escalation, including strikes on Iranian power plants. There was even open speculation about the possible use of weapons of mass destruction. Thankfully, that did not happen. By that point, the war with Iran had already been going on for more than a month. The Trump administration seemed increasingly lost in trying to manage a crisis of its own making. In mid-March, President Trump gave Iran a 48-hour ultimatum, then extended it several times after it was ignored by the Islamic Republic. Tehran, despite the bombing campaign, was not backing down. Quite the opposite. It appeared to be growing more confident. Not only did it ignore Trump's demands, it began putting forward its own. Just before the ultimatum expired, Iran issued a new 10-point list of conditions for ending the war. To surprise of many, Trump did not bomb Iran, despite the apocalyptic rhetoric. Instead, he reviewed the Iranian terms and announced that they could serve as a workable basis for peace talks. As a result, both sides agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. The war is now entering a temporary state of suspension, without any clear resolution. Let's dig into that. Right now, every positive headline about a ceasefire between the United States and Iran is being reflected by global markets almost in real time. Because investors know this is about much more than just diplomacy. It is about oil, shipping, inflation, and the risk of a wider regional shock. That is why when I work on analyses like this, I try to look at them not only through a political lens, but also through the perspective of global markets. And one of the tools I use for that is XTB. The XTB platform gives you access to over 8,700 stocks and ETFs from around the world, including companies in energy, commodities, and logistics that directly respond to situations like this. You can track in real time how global events shape the markets and invest commission-free up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover. Then 0.2% provision applies. Remember though, every investment involves risk. Since mid-March, when it became clear that a quick victory over Iran was not possible, Donald Trump had been looking for a way out of the conflict. His chosen method was to pressure Tehran through a series of ultimatums. The first came on March 21st. Iran was given 48 hours to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. If it refused, Trump threatened to authorize strikes on Iranian power plants. But Tehran not only ignored the American warning, it also made clear that such an attack would trigger Iranian retaliation against Arab and Israeli power plants, as well as desalination facilities. Trump then pushed the deadline back repeatedly, first to March 27th, then to April 6th, and then by another 24 hours. Each extension was accompanied by claims that negotiations were ongoing behind the scenes and that both sides were close to a deal. Claims that were repeatedly denied by both Iran and Pakistan, the main intermediary relaying messages between Washington and Tehran. Perhaps the clearest sign of Trump's frustration came in a post on April 5th, quote, "Tuesday will be power plant day and bridge day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the fucking strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch." And yet, Tuesday, April 7th did not bring a wave of bombing raids on Iranian infrastructure. It brought a ceasefire. That ceasefire was negotiated through the night. Pakistan's army chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, was reportedly in simultaneous contact with Vice President Vance, envoy Steve Witkoff, and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Prime Minister Sharif publicly appealed to Trump to extend the deadline by 2 weeks, while also asking Iran to reopen the strait as a gesture of goodwill. Trump and the Iranians ultimately reached an agreement 90 minutes before the ultimatum expired. According to Trump's post on Truth Social, the United States will suspend further strikes, while Iran is to unblock the Strait of Hormuz in return. During the ceasefire, both sides are expected to hold talks on a broader peace agreement based on the 10 points put forward by Iran. According to Iranian media, those terms include the lifting of sanctions on Iran, continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz, a withdrawal of US forces from the Middle East, an end to attacks on Iran and its allies, and the release of frozen Iranian assets. It is easy to see that these terms, presented in this form, suggest that it is not the United States, but Iran that would emerge from this confrontation as the victor. Of course, that does not mean they will be accepted in their current form, but the very fact that after a month of bombing and decapitation strikes against the leadership, Trump described them as a good basis for further negotiations is revealing in itself. Moreover, according to a statement issued by the Iranian side, for a period of 2 weeks, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz will be possible through coordination with the Iranian armed forces and subject to technical limitations. It may suggest that Iran will continue to restrict traffic through the Strait of Hormuz to some extent during the ceasefire, with fully passage restored only after a final peace agreement is reached. The ceasefire was received with enormous enthusiasm in Tehran. Iran's Supreme National Security Council issued a special statement stressing that the United States had been defeated and forced to accept Iran's 10-point proposal. It is also worth noting that the Iranians are calling for an end to the war on all fronts, including against the Islamic resistance in Lebanon. Netanyahu, however, insists that the agreement does not apply to the Lebanese theater. That raises the obvious question: why would the Americans, and Trump in particular, agree to a ceasefire, especially one presented in a way so favorable to Iran? Although Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was already claiming in mid-March that Iran's armed forces had been destroyed, the real picture looks very different. Iranian military capabilities have undoubtedly been seriously degraded, but Iran still retains substantial force and remains capable of sustaining attacks on Arab states and Israel. Leaks from US intelligence assessments published in the press also do not align with the picture presented by members of the administration. Estimates suggest that Iran may still retain as much as half of its missile launchers. Its drone stockpiles appear to have been hit even less severely. What is more, the effectiveness of Iranian attacks appears to be rising. An analysis published by the Jewish Institute for National Security of America found that while the success rate of Iranian strikes on Israel during the first 2 weeks of the war was estimated at just 3%, from March 13th to March 22nd, that figure rose to 27%. The institute attributes this mainly to the use of cluster munitions. But cluster munitions alone do not explain a series of highly effective and remarkably precise Iranian strikes on US military installations across the region. A good example is the late March Iranian strike on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, where they reportedly managed to destroy an E-3 Sentry airborne early warning aircraft parked on the tarmac, along with at least one KC-135 Stratotanker aerial refueling aircraft. Even Iran's air defense network, one of the first targets of the US-Israeli air campaign and one that has been heavily degraded, still appears to retain some localized defensive capability that is further reinforced by large numbers of manpads, or man-portable air defense systems. The clearest proof came in the events of April 3rd to 5th, when Iran managed to shoot down an F-15E heavy fighter and then damage 2 HH-60 Pavehawk helicopters involved in the extraction of the American crew. Iran also brought down an A-10 attack aircraft, and 2 MQ-9 Reaper drones that had been taking part in the rescue operation. But that was not the end of the American losses. During the mission, the US also lost MC-130J transport aircraft and 4 MH-6 Little Bird helicopters. According to the Americans, those aircraft were destroyed by US forces themselves at a forward airstrip prepared roughly 50 kilometers south of Isfahan, specifically for the evacuation of the downed F-15 crew. It is worth noting, however, that the operation ultimately succeeded, and both American airmen were extracted from Iran. These quote details lead to strategic consequences. The war with Iran is already undermining America's military posture in the Pacific theater. In the first 4 weeks of the war, the United States fired roughly 850 Tomahawk missiles. Pre-war stockpiles were estimated at around 3,000 to 4,500, while the 2026 budget set aside funding for just 57 new missiles. The situation looks even worse when it comes to low observable air-launched cruise missiles, the JASM-ER. Since the start of the war, the US has used as many as 1,000 of them. Pre-war inventory? Only about 2,300. Interceptor stocks are also being depleted at a rapid pace, especially for Patriot and THAAD air defense systems. The intensity of Iranian strikes has already forced Washington to redeploy some of those systems from Asia to the Middle East. As a result, the war with Iran will have a lasting impact on US military capabilities in the context of any future defense of Taiwan. Virtually every wargame examining a potential US-China conflict over the island, including those discussed on our channel, shows that the decisive factor would be the number of precision-guided weapons available for the United States to destroy a Chinese invasion fleet and disrupt operations in Chinese ports. Instead, the war with Iran is leaving the US facing roughly a 5-year timeline just to rebuild its missile stockpiles to where they stood before February 28, 2026. And even those pre-war levels were hardly reassuring in the context of a high-intensity conflict with the People's Liberation Army. The shrinking of US military capabilities in the Pacific matters mainly to decision-makers and planners in Washington and Beijing. For the rest of the world, for global markets and financial exchanges, the most important consequence was the prolonged blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which triggered the most serious energy crisis since the Arab oil embargo of 1973. Traffic through the strait fell by more than 90%, effectively removing 12 million barrels of oil per day from the market, around 12% of global supply. There is, in theory, infrastructure that can bypass Hormuz, but it is nowhere near sufficient. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline running to Yanbu on the Red Sea is operating at its full capacity of 7 million barrels per day, but the port itself can load only around 5 million. The UAE's Habshan-Fujairah pipeline carries about 1.6 million barrels per day, and while the port of Fujairah should in theory be able to handle that volume, repeated Iranian drone attacks have reduced its export capacity. In total, the export routes that bypass Hormuz can handle only about 5.5 million barrels per day. A modest figure, given that before the war, nearly 4 times as much oil passed through Hormuz, around 20 million barrels per day. Unable to export crude and facing rapidly filling storage facility, Gulf producers were forced to cut output. In the first 10 days alone, Saudi Arabia reduced production by roughly 2.5 million barrels per day. Iraq, which has very limited alternative export routes, cut output by as much as 2.9 million barrels per day, equivalent to 60% of its total production. As analysts note, the key gap is that this bypass infrastructure was designed for crude oil, and not for the full range of hydrocarbons that normally move through Hormuz. Refined products, LNG and LPG, simply do not have pipeline alternatives. That helps explain why product markets have been under even greater stress than crude itself. Asian steam crackers, major petrochemical complexes that source more than 60% of their naphtha from the Middle East, declared force majeure in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore. China, meanwhile, banned all exports of refined products, removing another 400 to 600,000 barrels per day from the Asian market. Europe faced similar problems until the ceasefire. While it imports relatively little crude from the Gulf, it remains heavily dependent on Arab suppliers for jet fuel and diesel. And where some lose, others profit. Iran, for its part, moved to impose a new order in the Strait, something like a wartime toll gate. Tankers seeking passage were required to submit full details on ownership, cargo, destination, and route. And that was not all. Tehran also demanded a transit fee. For oil tankers, the charge was about $1 per barrel. Payment was collected in Chinese yuan or crypto stablecoins. $1 per barrel may not sound like much, but for a fully loaded VLCC supertanker, it can mean as much as $2 million for a single passage. By Tuesday, the system was being used mainly by ships from China, India, Russia, and Pakistan. But the first Western operators had also begun to use it. Between April 3rd and 4th, a French container vessel and a Japanese LNG tanker passed through Hormuz, paying in yuan and using a new route running along Oman's coastline. The biggest winner of the crisis, however, has been Russia. As recently as February, after Trump tightened sanctions, Ural's crude had fallen to around $40 per barrel. And Russian budget revenues from oil were down 48% year-on-year. But the US war with Iran effectively rescued the Russian budget. In an effort to stabilize global oil prices, Trump temporarily eased sanctions on Russia. Combined with the global supply shock that sent the price of Ural's crude soaring to around $120 a barrel, more than triple its level a month earlier. The Kyiv School of Economics estimated that if the war were to last 3 months, Russia could earn an additional $161 billion in export revenues, more than the country's entire 2025 budget deficit. Ukraine, however, responded by imposing sanctions of its own, striking Russian export terminals and partially offsetting a trend that was turning sharply against it. We often talk about oil prices in shorthand, but it is worth pausing here, because the distortions during the crisis have been extraordinary. Oil is traded on two parallel markets. Under normal conditions, they move broadly together. In a crisis, they can diverge dramatically. The paper market consists of future contracts, agreements to deliver oil at a later date, traded on exchanges such as ICE in London for Brent and NYMEX in New York for WTI. Those are the prices you see in the headlines. But there is also the physical market, where what matters is the real barrel, the oil actually loaded onto tankers and delivered to refineries. So when Trump says at the press conference that we are getting closer to a ceasefire, traders can immediately start selling futures and the paper price drops. But the physical barrel in the ports still costs the same, because the tanker carrying it still has not passed through the Strait of Hormuz. That is why on April 3rd, Brent futures were trading at just $109 a barrel, while the actual physical barrel was selling for roughly $141 a barrel, the highest level since the 2008 financial crisis. The world is trying to shield itself from the energy crisis by releasing strategic reserves. On March 11th, all member states of the International Energy Agency unanimously agreed to release 400 million barrels from their stockpiles, twice the volume put onto the market after Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But 400 million barrels amounts to just 20 days of normal flow through Hormuz. Analysts therefore began warning that if the war dragged on, the world could face outright physical fuel shortages, something already visible in parts of the Asian market. That risk is even greater because some countries do not hold full strategic reserves. The United States is a striking example. it entered the conflict with only 415 million barrels in reserve, roughly 57% of its full strategic capacity. But the Persian Gulf is not only about oil, gas, and refined fuels. It also accounts for roughly 50% of global sulfur trade, 33% of global urea trade, and 25% of global ammonia trade. Because of the war, QAFCO, the Qatari fertilizer giant responsible for 14% of global urea supply, suspended production, and world urea prices rose by around 50%. That means higher fertilizer prices and ultimately higher food prices. All this makes it clear why an Iran that has been battered and bombed can still afford to make such maximalist demands. The blockade of Hormuz has been effective. The world is already standing on the brink of the worst oil shock in the last 50 years, while the United States has burned through the vast resources without delivering a decisive outcome. And so we are now entering a brief strategic pause. For the Americans, this is a moment to regroup and think more carefully about what comes next. Iran, meanwhile, has interpreted Washington's willingness to treat its 10-point plan as the basis for negotiations as a meaningful tactical victory, and as a sign that the other side is beginning to bend. That in turn makes any binding peace talks extraordinarily difficult, especially with an unhappy Israel that will almost certainly play a central role in them. And so, in 2 weeks, Washington may once again face the same dilemma, and the same two paths. The first is to slip out of this war as quietly as possible, leaving the Arabs and Israel to deal with the fallout while hoping they can find a way to keep the strait open without allowing Tehran full control over it. The second is to continue the war, including further escalation and potentially even a ground operation. Both options look extremely costly, and that is a sign of strategic failure.